I continue to take baby steps toward a grimdark style without the use of washes, enamels, oils, or solvents. I am very comfortable using these products and I've used them quite extensively in my painting tutorials. However, with so much great content already out there by channels like the Grimdark Compendium, I figured I would go in a different direction. Taking an approach that relies solely on acrylic paints may encourage more people to try this style of painting. I may introduce other products such as nouche or powdered pigments in the future, but for now I'm keeping things simple. I'm using the usual dark blue primer for this miniature and I plan to have 3 light sources affecting this character. I'll paint the character's front as if natural light is coming from its upper right. I'll paint the back with a moonlight glow, and I'll paint some red OSL as if it's coming from below the character on its left side. The moonlight glow and OSL will be painted very quickly, leaving me with only about 1/3 of the miniature to spend any real time on. For the red OSL, I'm using Dragon Red by the Army Painter, spraying the paint from below the miniature. This application of paint is heavier than what I will achieve with the moonlight because I want the red OSL to be quite intense. I'm taking a page out of the Dead General's book by using mahogany through an airbrush to set up the naturally lit portion of the Tormentor. After seeing how well this worked with the Undead General, I decided to continue using it on subsequent minis. What I like about using the brown through an airbrush is that it creates a natural drop-off into the dark blue shadows, and I can start building my highlights directly over this dark brown layer. The base layer of the moonlight gets a very quick and very light coat of Vallejo Azure through an airbrush. This is mostly done so I can see where the moonlight would affect the Tormentor. I'll place more detailed highlights with a standard brush in a bit. I intensify the moonlight glow by deliberately placing azure highlights. I have previously mentioned that I was going to eliminate the moonlight glow from these Grimcoven miniatures, and I still may do that for some, but for now I decide to reduce the intensity of the blue and give the moonlight another go. This azure color seems like a cold blue color, and I think it's a fitting match for the dark atmosphere of this game. This quick 2-step process is all it takes to paint approximately half of the miniature. Compared to the moonlight, the red OSL has 2 additional steps that are pretty quick as well. First, I intensify the red with Scarlet Blood Game Color. This is painted on downward facing bits and is applied within the red foundation that we established with the airbrush. Then I hit the edges and some of the more prominent features with titanium white. If you want to save some time, you can apply these white highlights directly over the airbrush portion of the red OSL and then use a single coat of Scarlet Blood over the white. If you choose to do it that way, you'll want to extend the final layer of red paint a little bit beyond the white highlights. I do one more pass with Scarlet Blood over these titanium white highlights. This should make the red OSL pop. With the moonlight and red OSL finished, we can get to the real painting. This technique for painting a miniature is more than just a shortcut. It produces distinctive looking miniatures that stand apart from what so many other gamers paint. But mostly it's a shortcut. I'm treating all of the skulls and bones that extend from the Tormentor's toes up to his head as a single highly textured surface. For the most part, I'm simply dragging the side of my brush across the textured surface. I'm using a size 2 synthetic brush for this. I have the tip of the brush flattened somewhat, so it covers more area with each swipe. I don't want to spend too much time with this first pass of necrotic flesh. I have several more steps that will follow this initial layer to make it look more integrated. I will tint the bones with a translucent brown, paint the recesses surrounding the bones with a blood-like red color, and use some green to model the finish of the skulls. The only area I will take my time painting more precisely is the one skull that represents the Tormentor's actual head. I'm using Vallejo Model Air Mahogany to tint all of the bones. I'm intentionally applying every layer of paint in a haphazard way. I feel that these corrupted, grief-bound enemies should look imperfect and disgusting. This means that I will bounce around a bit, adding random but interesting colors here and there. This will help break the uniform appearance of the character's features and make him look more chaotic. After I'm done with the mahogany glaze, I return to necrotic flesh to touch up the decaying bones on the upper part of the Tormentor's body. I want the upper portion of the model to be brighter than the lower body, as if it's being affected more by the natural light. Even though I'm occasionally returning to the exact same color for the exact same area, the paint is applied so quickly and randomly that the process moves quickly. I now model things up a bit with some army paint or army green. When starting a scary step in the process, like randomly dotting dark green around the entire miniature, I like to begin with an unimportant area of the miniature. The backside of the miniature is a great place to start. That isn't going to work in this case since I have moonlight on the back. So I start with the lower part of the miniature. If things look good there, then I will continue over the rest of the model. Stippling in random colors like green and blue is something I've only started doing with these Grimcoven miniatures. I've always enjoyed painting my board game miniatures, but this is some of the most fun I've had painting in a while. I really do like experimenting with new approaches to painting. I create my favorite blood recipe with crusted sore and translucent burnt umber ink to slather all around the bones on the Tormentor's body. At least I plan to make my favorite blood effect. You see, my favorite recipe is actually made with glistening blood and burnt umber ink, but I accidentally grabbed the wrong bottle of Army Painter red paint. This mix didn't look quite right to me when I was making it, but I pressed on. It wasn't until I was reviewing the footage for this video that I realized I used the wrong paint. Glistening blood is an effect paint, whereas crusted sore is a standard acrylic paint. But this little screw-up is a testament to the fact that using the one and only correct paint isn't necessary to get great results. If I see a painter using a paint that I don't own and I want to replicate what they're painting, I can probably find a suitable substitute in my collection. It doesn't have to be exact, it just needs to be close. I'm also using this bloody mix to base coat the Tormentor's arms. The arms will have pink highlights with blood red recesses. I'm using titanium white ink to create highlights over the blood red base. I'm only doing this near the top of the model. Again, I want the upper portion of the miniature to appear brighter than the lower part. Then I'll use pure crusted sore to glaze over the white highlights. And I'll use it to continue to layer up the color on the Tormentor's flesh. I'm kind of painting things out of order from what I would normally do because I'm taking advantage of colors that are already on my palette. Normally I paint one area to completion before moving on to the next. I'm base coating the Tormentor's arms now because it uses the same color as the bloody matter around the bones. I'll quickly finish up the bones before continuing with the skin. The bones only need one final highlight of ice yellow. I spent some time building up significant highlights on the one skull that is the Tormentor's head. This is a pretty damn unusual looking mini. Personally, I think that the tiny skull for a head looks kind of ridiculous, but I see what the designer is going for here. This creature is a hodgepodge of dead bodies congealed into a single large abomination. But they probably could have used some sort of larger like animal skull for the main head. Something that would scale better to the rest of the body without looking silly. Anyway, the rest of the bones surrounding this tiny head get very quick highlights dabbed into place. Now I use a mix of salmon rose and crusted sore to continue painting the skin. There is such a small amount of visible flesh on this guy, and it's so highly textured that I probably could have dry brushed this layer into place. For a lot of it, I'm just dragging the side of my loaded brush along the textured forearm. For smooth areas, like the fingers and the left forearm, I use a more precise application with the tip of my brush. I'll use Salmon Rose all by its lonesome to add some final highlights to the Tormentor's arms. The Salmon Rose is the perfect highlight color for the flesh, but I do find that these lighter flesh tone colors can often have a chalky finish. Therefore, I usually like to glaze a little of the previous color over the final highlight. I'm only applying highlights to the most raised and upward facing bits of this abomination's hide. For the glaze, I thin down some crusted sore and apply it over the Salmon Rose. I don't have to be as careful with this as I normally would with a traditional glaze. In fact, I could just apply this as a wash, since it will blend perfectly with the crusted sore that is already present in the recesses. As an important side note, I did stipple in a thin application of phthalo blue on the arms and bones just as I did with the army green. I've scoured my video footage for this, but I must have lost it. You can see an example of this blue stippling in my Corrupted Gunslinger video. The final item that we need to paint before getting to all of the metallic bits is the ratty-ass coat. I'm going with a dark blue-gray for this. I begin with a heavy stipple of Payne's Gray. Once the Payne's Gray is in place, I incrementally add ice yellow to the Payne's Gray to work towards some bright highlights. With each layer, I'm covering less and less territory on the coat. Every layer is stippled into place to create the illusion of texture. I want the jacket to look weathered and worn, like it's decaying alongside the rotting corpses this creature is made of. I've intentionally splayed out the bristles at the end of my brush to aid with this application. This is a large garment, so to try to stipple all of the highlights over such a large area would be insane with a fine tip brush. I'm also using a cheap synthetic brush for this because this is considered brush abuse in many cultures. As the layers get lighter, I focus more and more on the edges and raised folds. As I reach the final brightness for these highlights, only the upper part of the coat will receive paint. Before diving right into the rust effects, I warm both the Dirty Down Rust and the miniature in front of a small space heater. As I slather the Dirty Down Rust over all of the metal objects on the miniature, I continue to work directly in front of the space heater. If working with Dirty Down for more than a couple of minutes, it will cease to bloom properly as it cools. I found this out the hard way when painting the Undead General. I warmed everything up away from my painting desk and then relocated the rust and the miniature to my workstation. The rust effect appeared beautifully at first, but as I progressed across the miniature over a few minutes, the Dirty Down Rust stopped performing. I can only assume that this is because it started to cool down below the optimal working temperature. Working directly in front of the space heater seems to have remedied this flaw. I also have a broken down cardboard box that I use as my work surface. So I twist the deck screw painting handle that I always use into this surface so I can use both hands for the rust effects. One hand to hold the bottle of rust and the other to hold the paintbrush. I let this rust effect dry completely before moving on to the metallic paints. I use a mix of black and bronze metallic paints for the base of the bronze items on this piece. I'm choosing Artist Loft metallic paints because of their pore coverage. This will allow more of the rust to show through. Rust tends to form more in cracks and crevices and recesses, so as long as I keep the paint out of those areas, this should create a decent rusty metal effect. In addition to the weapon the Tormentor is holding, I also want the box he's standing on to have a bronze finish. The metal straps on the head of the weapon and all of the chains around the miniature will receive a dark gunmetal finish. Now we switch to pure bronze metallic paint for the highlight. This is applied with stippling rather than being brushed on. In typical layering fashion, I'm covering less area with this layer than with the previous layer. With the darker layer, I was fine with it hitting some of the parts that will be gunmetal. It's a dark enough color that it wouldn't negatively affect the gunmetal color. But with this brighter bronze color, I am being more careful not to hit the surrounding accent pieces. For the chains and such, I'm mixing Army Painter gunmetal with Artist Loft metallic black. I lightly brush this over the chains, spikes, and bands around the weapon. In hindsight, I probably could have left more rust visible on this guy. This is still a new process for me, and I learn a little something every time I try it. There are a couple of things that I'll do differently when attempting this look in the future, but I will save that for another video. I'd like to thank my incredible channel members for encouraging me to keep making these videos. You too can become a channel member using the link in the description below and receive perks such as early access to videos, extended versions of our painting tutorials, and even a tier that lets you decide which miniature I paint next. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of grimdark wannabes.